Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for being here today. I am absolutely delighted to be able to introduce my fantastic panel. So we have Commissioner Allison Lee, who will speak at the beginning. And we have Satyam Khanna. We have Commissioner Rob Jackson. We have Bob Stebbins. And then we have also Commissioner Joe Grundfest. So for the beginning of this panel, each of our panelists are going to speak for about 5 minutes on a topic of their choice and something that they think is really important and something that, keeps them up at night and that they think is really important to communicate to the audience. So we'll go around. Commissioner Lee has volunteered to go first. So for those of you who, this is a woman who really needs no introduction, but I'll provide one nonetheless. So former SEC acting chair and Commissioner Allison Lee were sworn into office on July 8th, 2019. She served as acting chair of the commission from January 21st, 2021 to April 17th, 2021. During her tenure, Commissioner Lee focused on bringing transparency and accountability to markets on issues related to climate change and other ESG-related information. She has over 2 decades of experience as a securities law practitioner, and she has written, lectured, and taught courses internationally on financial regulation and corporate law. She was a member of the American Bar Association's former Committee on Public Company Disclosure, and she participated on a USAID project in Armenia, assisting in the drafting of a comprehensive law of the Republic of Armenia on securities market regulation. So, Commissioner Lee, thank you again for coming today, and I'll, let you take it from here.
Thank you, Colleen, and good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening to everyone, depending on where you're joining. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and especially a pleasure to participate in events like this, which are designed to encourage collaboration and the leveraging of resources between and among practitioners, regulators, academics, and others on the important topic of sustainable investing. And as you all know, the SEC recently proposed a rule, actually back in March of this year, to require disclosures around the risks and the opportunities that public companies face with respect to climate change. And I know you're going to hear from some of the other panelists today, my colleagues here, about some legal and some jurisdictional issues with respect to the proposal, and I'm very much looking forward to that discussion. What I would like to do, however, is focus a bit on the policy choices that are reflected in this rule. And given that we also, I know, have a focus on accounting here and a number of important accounting academics in attendance, what I'd like to do is drill down a little bit on the accounting policy choices that are reflected in the proposal. So let me start with just a big picture overview of the major provisions in the proposed rule. It essentially borrows from or leverages the TCFD protocol, so risks and opportunities, governance over those risks and opportunities, strategy related to those risks and opportunities. And then we have targets and metrics piece, just as TCFD does. And here again, the proposal would leverage the existing GHG protocol. So you would have to disclose scopes 1 and 2. All companies would have to disclose scopes 1 and 2 GHG emissions. Scope 3 emissions would only have to be disclosed if they are material or if a company has scope 3 targets. Then the 5th piece in the rule is directly in the financial statements and would require a footnote that disaggregates climate impacts and expenditures in line items in the financial statements where the total impact or the cost is at least 1%. So those are the 5 big picture elements of the proposed rule: risk, governance, strategy, GHG emissions, footnote disaggregation in the financial statements. And as I mentioned, I know this is an accounting related conference, so I'd like to call attention and invite debate around a couple of the policy choices related to the accounting aspects of the rule, focused mainly on the reporting of GHG emissions and the level of reliability around those disclosures. The SEC has proposed third-party verification of only scopes 1 and 2. There's no proposed verification around any company that's required to disclose scope 3 emissions. And the way the verification would work with respect to scopes 1 and 2 is, in the first year, no assurance required. In the second and the third years would start with what's known as limited assurance or review, which is the level that we see for like 10Qs and quarterly reports. And then after a 3-year ramp up, it would proceed to what's known as reasonable assurance, which is the level we have for 10Ks. So the third And the third-party verifier does not have to be a public accounting firm, but rather it can be an engineering firm or some other type of firm, as is currently in use, so long as they meet certain standards for independence and expertise. So some questions. How important are the reporting of GHG emissions to investors and markets? And what does that importance implicate in terms of how reliable we need and want those numbers to be? Do we need third-party verification at all on GHG emissions? And if so, is it appropriate to limit the verification to just Scope 1 and Scope 2? And also, if we have third-party assurance, should we progress from limited to reasonable assurance? So I'd kind of like to get I'd love to have some discussion around how we should be thinking about what appears to be kind of a weedsy distinction here. But let me just explain, so that you can see that the answer, I think, to this question is driven largely by one's view of the importance of the underlying disclosure. You think about, for example, a person who examines your parachute before you go skydiving. Would you be content to hear that a review shows nothing to indicate a problem with the chute, or would you instead want to know that the chute has been examined and found to be sound in all material respects? Now, on the other hand, let's say you're grocery shopping and you're picking out fruit. Is it enough to just outwardly observe that there are no real problems, or would you want a thorough examination of each piece of fruit? So I mention these examples to bring focus on the fact that the answer to the level of reliability really does depend on your view of the importance of the information to investors and markets. So I'll just conclude with this. My own personal view is that GHG emissions may be the single most important element of disclosure within this proposed rule. I think a lot of investor money is going to change hands based on that particular metric. So that, in my view, militates toward greater emphasis on reliability. Let me stop there because I look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists and colleagues on this and other topics as well. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner. I think, yes, it's definitely a huge question for us in accounting, and I'm so glad to hear that you guys are thinking a lot about it as well. So next we have Satyam Khanna. Satyam Khanna is the CEPR Policy Fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, where his research focuses on financial regulation, corporate governance, and sustainability. He joined Stanford after serving as the SEC's Senior Policy Advisor for Climate and ESG, the agency's first ever official dedicated to integrating ESG considerations into federal securities law, where he worked under Acting Chair Allison Lee. Before that, he was counsel to SEC Commissioner Rob Jackson, and he was an advisor at the Financial Stability Oversight Council at the U.S. Treasury Department. So, Satyam, thank you for coming here today as well.
Thanks for having me, Colleen and team. So Allison provided a really nice layout of the key issues at the SEC with respect to assurance, and in particular, at the end, highlighted emissions disclosure. I want to make 2 points generally about the SEC's activity on climate disclosure, but particularly emissions. The first is that we should be clear-eyed about the limits of the SEC's authority, specifically a regulatory gap on climate financial disclosure that we all need to be aware of is over private markets, because the SEC's climate disclosure rules won't cover privately held companies for the most part. And as you know, those markets are large and growing. There are more private companies now. They are staying private longer. And we all need to be thinking more closely about what the lack of transparency in private markets means for investors who are considering climate-related risks. Now, other regulators aside from the SEC, such as the Fed, the OCC, CFTC, and others, may be able to shine a light into some pieces of those markets. I'll concede that. Coordinating bodies like that of the FSOC at Treasury, where I used to work, and the Office of Financial Research will also play a crucial role in looking at various regulatory gaps. But the bottom line is that for those in the audience who are thinking about financial regulation and climate, the opacity of private markets is an issue because it has a number of implications for investors. The second point I'll make is that while the SEC's authority indeed has limits, we should be clear about the uniqueness of the SEC's role in this space. Specifically, I've seen commentary that the proper role for climate disclosures is not the SEC, specifically emissions disclosure, is not the SEC but the EPA, or that the Clean Air Act impliedly repeals the SEC's authority over the 1933 and 34 Acts over greenhouse gas emissions. And those arguments, in my view, are mistaken as a matter of law because implied repeal is heavily disfavored, and more importantly, in my view, impractical as a matter of policy. I spent time last year at the EPA on a detail from the SEC, so I have some sense of what relying on its greenhouse gas reporting program for purposes of investor protection would entail. That program, the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program at the EPA, is indeed a greenhouse gas emissions reporting program, but it is there for an entirely different purpose than at the SEC. It regulates, in fact, at the facility level, and critically, it only regulates U.S. emissions sources. There are also statutory carve-outs and various reporting thresholds that would make analyzing emissions information from the perspective of an investor extraordinarily difficult, to say nothing of the SEC attempting to integrate that reporting program into securities filings. I would encourage folks to read a comment letter to the SEC in its climate disclosure rule from the EPA itself on this very point. So I'll leave it at that. We should be mindful of the limits of the SEC's reach, but at the same time, the agency plays a crucial and unique role in climate disclosure in our overall regulatory system.
Next, we have Bob Stebbins. So Bob, thank you again for joining us today. So Bob Stebbins worked at Willkie, Farr, and Gallagher from 1993 to 2017. First as an associate, and then as a partner in the firm's corporate transactional practice. From May 2017 through January 2021, he served as general counsel of the SEC. Upon leaving the commission, he returned to Willkie, where he is again a partner in the firm's transactional practice, as well as co-head of the firm's corporate governance practice. So, Bob, thank you very much for being here, and we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Forgot to mention I'm also on Commissioner Jackson's board. That's the biggest thing. Yeah, it's nice to be with everybody. Nice to see a lot of faces again that I remember. I just wanted to talk quickly about the Jarkessi decision as well as the West Virginia case. And I know Commissioner Grundfest and Commissioner Jackson are going to have at it on this, but just I'll give you my views quickly on this. So a lot of boards, I do a lot of board work, speak to a lot of general counsels. They're very interested in ESG. It's very important to the boards. I think these decisions have the potential to make life difficult for everybody because, in my view, I think the rule's going to pass. I don't know if it's going to pass with Scope 3 in it or not, but I think it's going to pass, and I'm quite concerned that it's not going to survive, at least the Supreme Court. I think it has a good shot of surviving the D.C. Circuit. So the Jarkessi decision to start with, that is something that deals with administrative judges, something that's maybe not really on point for this panel, though I'm sure everyone on the panel is interested in it, maybe not everyone in the audience. The most interesting thing I thought coming out of it was this raising of the non-delegation doctrine. I didn't think the argument was that great, but they raised it at the Fifth Circuit. It's going to go up to the court. It's going on bonk first. So this SEC definitely will need to take this on. And the administrative law issue as to removal and the ALJs is a very tricky one for the government, but I don't know that it's really on point for this one, but I'm going to be really interested to see what happens. I think it's going to be very difficult to have taking away all the ALJs from the federal government. Doesn't sound like a very good idea to me. And it's going to be really tough to thread the needle here for the court. But on to climate. So while this decision had come down, soon after that, the West Virginia decision came down. And this raising of the major questions doctrine, which seems to make the non-delegation doctrine not matter so much, and Jarkessi not matter as much for the environmental release. But the major questions doctrine, to quote in the back, it says, in particular, we have understood Congress does not usually grant agencies the authority to decide significant issues on which they have no particular expertise. So when there is a mismatch between the agency's usual portfolio and a given assertion of power, courts have reason to question whether Congress intended a delegation to go so far. That's from Kagan. That's not from the majority. So given that statement, and then you can imagine the statements from the majority, I have trouble seeing the court supporting the climate disclosure rules. There's great people in the government who are going to argue on behalf of these. Michael Conley in the GC's office is as good as they get. The SG's office is phenomenal. They're going to put out the best arguments. They're going to say it's disclosure. These are disclosure rules. It's right in what the SEC always does. When I read the rule, there's a lot in it. I just think it's going to be a very difficult case. And I will let Commissioner Grundfest and Commissioner Jackson take it from there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Bob. And I think next we have Commissioner Grundfest. So Joe Grundfest is my colleague here at Stanford Law School, where he is the William A. Franke Professor of Business Law, and he is also senior faculty at the Rock Center for Corporate Governance. He is a former SEC commissioner and currently chairs the Audit Committee at KKR. In addition, as a fun fact about Joe, he is a former director of Financial Engines, which he co-founded with Bill Sharp, the 1990 Nobel laureate in economics. So Joe, thank you again for coming here. We're delighted to hear you, and please take it away.
Thank you very much. And Rob, I'd like to thank you for a terrific setup for my presentation. What Rob pointed out, and I think this is really profound, is the SEC's rule is subject to material litigation risk. I think there's universal consensus around that. And people can have different points of view with regard to how significant that risk is and the various parameters of legal doctrine upon which the rule might survive or just utterly crash. And I'm going to expand on that a little bit. But before I do that, what I'd like to suggest is that there's an entirely different way to go about the question of climate disclosure that relies on a different theory of the SEC authority and that gives rise to a strategy that economists would call Pareto superior. What that means is whether or not the courts rule that the SEC does or doesn't have the authority to adopt the rules, this alternative approach leads to better climate disclosure or a higher probability that the courts will approve the climate disclosure than anything that the SEC has on the table now. Let me take a step back and let me position myself in this debate. I strongly favor climate disclosure, unambiguously. I do, however, have profound questions about the legal strategy that the SEC is using to achieve an objective that I strongly support. And let me lay out what might well be a better way to get from here to there. And it's better on two dimensions. Dimension one, it gives us more expansive disclosure than anything that the SEC is currently requiring. And it allows that disclosure to be updated and to remain timely and to evolve in a way far better than the SEC can do itself. Second, there's significant litigation risk here. Even the strongest supporters of the rule will say there is litigation risk. The approach that I'm going to suggest has far lower litigation risk than anything the SEC has on the table. Let me describe what it is. And at a certain level, it's shockingly simple. All it basically says is the SEC should adopt two additional rules. Rule 1. For every registrant that's required to disclose emissions or make other environmental disclosures, pursuant to regulations that are required by some other regulatory authority, whether it's the European Union, subject to the rules that they're going to propose, that everybody looks at and it says, if these rules come in place, they are more expansive than anything the SEC is going to require. Or whether it's pursuant to California SB 260, all right, which currently is likely to pass out here in the great state of California, which would require mandatory Scope 3 disclosures by everyone, regardless of whether it's material or not. Plus, you've got the EPA existing greenhouse gas reporting program. My proposal would simply say for every registrant, look, if you're required to report greenhouse gas emissions or make other environmental disclosures, pursuant to other regulatory authorities, simply aggregate up that information that's already publicly available, report it in a standardized form. I don't care for present purposes whether it's furnished, whether it's, filed. Let's put that aside. We'll get to that. And simply report in a rational, aggregated way that eliminates double counting on a single form as part of an annual reporting regime by the SEC. Simply look at what the EU is doing. Simply look at what California is doing. Simply look at what the EPA already requires. You aggregate that up, and we get better climate disclosure than anything that the SEC will require, even if the SEC's rules are entirely adopted as currently proposed. So, from that perspective, if you are confident that the SEC's rules are fully legal and that the current Supreme Court will adopt them, you should support my approach. You get better, more expansive disclosure, and that's what we want. Now, let's look at the dark side of the moon. What are the odds that this Supreme Court upholds these rules? My personal view, and I respect people that have a different perspective, is it's not a high number. All right, let's realize that this is the Supreme Court that did not allow the vaccine mandates. This is the Supreme Court that vacated the eviction moratorium. This is the Supreme Court that gratuitously granted cert. It didn't need to grant cert in West Virginia versus EPA. And as I predicted, those regs were going to go down in a flaming mess, and you would have an expansive, muscular interpretation of the major questions doctrine. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. And I think Mr. Stebbins' view that there's significant risk for the SEC with regard to these rules is a very, very well-informed perspective. If that's right, the proposal that I'm suggesting has an infinitely better chance of surviving appellate review. Why? Because it's based on an entirely different interpretation of the SEC's authority. All it's saying is that the SEC has authority to take information that is already in the public domain. The SEC is not requiring that any company do anything new with regard to measurement. Take the information that's already in the public domain, aggregate that information, provide it in one place in order that you have informational efficiency and so that it promotes price formation in the market. That's it. The SEC is asserting no authority over climate disclosure. The SEC is simply saying informational aggregation, informational efficiency. That is a theory that is far more likely to withstand judicial scrutiny than anything in the 510-odd pages of the SEC's proposal. So if we wind up looking at the litigation risk element, we also, I think, clearly reach the conclusion that the probability that this type of rule, which is based on a very different theory of SEC authority, has a materially higher probability of withstanding judicial scrutiny and is less likely to be vacated. And just as importantly, even if you're optimistic about the SEC's authority, leads to a situation where we have better climate disclosure. So, net, nobody's more in favor of climate disclosure than I. My concern, legal strategy. The tactics, profoundly suboptimal. There's another way to go. And I think what the SEC can and should do is if it wants to go ahead with its current rules, fine. But in addition, let's add these additional disclosure requirements. It says, look, if you're already disclosing this pursuant to other regulatory authorities, just aggregate it up, report it on a form, let's eliminate the double counting, and let's get the investors the information that they clearly want with much lower litigation risk. And by the way, the cost-benefit profile of this approach is infinitely cheaper than the cost-benefit profile of the SEC's approach, which basically requires the creation of an entirely new measurement regime. I could go on, but I'll be kind to the audience and stop.
Good. Thank you, Joe. And then finally, we have Commissioner Jackson. So Rob Jackson was an investment banker before he went to law school. After graduation, he served on the Second Circuit, and then he practiced corporate law at Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen & Katz. He left Wachtell to serve at the U.S. Treasury Department, where he worked on the TARP bailouts and the Dodd-Frank Act, and then he left and returned to be a law professor at Columbia and then at NYU. In between, the president nominated him and the Senate unanimously confirmed him to serve as an SEC commissioner, a role he served in until 2020. So, Rob, thank you very much for participating today, and I'll let you go.
Well, thanks so much, Colleen. I'm just delighted to be on this panel with so many friends and former colleagues. Bob Stebbins, a tremendous general counsel. Allison Lee, my colleague, co-commissioner Satyam Khanna, who, like you, Colleen, back in the day, has the regrettable distinction of having been my student, and of course, the terrific Joe Grundfest, who preceded me as an academic serving on the commission. I want to start by just noting for all the folks watching, whether you're a lawyer or not, my guess is you have the experience in your life where you have a particular expertise, a thing you're really good at. And every once in a while, you're tempted to try something else, and the results can sometimes be disastrous. Like, for example, I'm a good lawyer, but I'm really not a handyman around the house. I leave that to other people because I got to tell you, otherwise my child, who you can see behind me over my shoulder, it's my 1-year-old son, would really not be safe. And what you've just heard on this panel is C+ constitutional lawyering from A+ securities lawyers. I'm going to explain to you for a little bit of background why you're hearing so many lawyers try to do the kind of law they really don't understand, why the legal threats that have been explained to the SEC's climate rules are not serious, and why they're not being taken seriously by the people at the SEC. And then I want to talk about what the real policy issues are that we should be discussing today. So first, to give you a sense of what's happening here, the SEC has proposed an important new climate disclosure rule. And in response, what you've gotten is the standard sort of Washington political response that you would expect. You've gotten a lot of pushback from those who say they're for more transparency, but in fact spend a lot of time lobbying against it. And to give you an impression, Professor Grundfest and some others have sent in comment letters to the SEC explaining over and over again that the Clean Air Act of 1974 is a crucial problem for the SEC's climate rule. And I, even though I'm not on the SEC anymore, I watched the SEC's comments, so I was taking a look, and that comment came in from Joe Grundfest, it came in from 20 academics in the field, it came in from a former commissioner, Paul Atkins, thought to be the most conservative ever commissioner to serve on the SEC. And I got to tell you, I'm a law professor, so I turned to my research assistants who work on this kind of stuff and said, boy, we really better read that Clean Air Act of 1974. It sounds like it's important, and I don't know the Clean Air Act. I'm a securities lawyer. My students came back and they said, Rob, this is a little awkward. There is no Clean Air Act of 1974, man. Like, that's not actually a thing that exists. Instead, the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, the same year that the President Nixon signed into law the National Economic Environmental Policy Act of 1970, which the SEC interpreted just a couple of years later to expressly say that the SEC is required by law to consider environmental matters and consider in connection with the implementation of its mission. Nobody who cited the Clean Air Act of 1974 mentioned that inconvenient fact, nor did they point out that the SEC has been requiring environmental-related disclosures, both material and not material, since the 1970s. And that's why I worked with a group of 4 former SEC chairs, 5 former commissioners, 5 SEC general counsel, and 4 directors of the division that writes these rules to explain to the SEC that these arguments about major questions are not serious, mostly advanced by securities lawyers who have a policy priority, who are trying to guess what Brett Kavanaugh might do in 3 years. They really don't know one way or the other. And to prove it, they advance arguments like Joe's that their preferred policy outcome is Pareto optimal. Now, this is the CARE conference, and I've been here a few times before, and you must have heard before someone who really cares about something calling it Pareto optimal. I also tell my wife that the things I'd like to do, like the restaurant I want to choose for dinner, is Pareto optimal, but that's my prior, that's not economics. Instead, actual economics tells you that Pareto optimal choices are only those that make everybody better off and no one worse off. And of course, Joe's proposals, by providing disclosure that is not designed for investor use to investors, has many, many costs. It also involves significant delay at the agency level and uncertainty in the market. All of those costs are very serious and foreclose the possibility that this might actually be Pareto optimal. No, these are not serious arguments, and the policymakers who are focused on it aren't so worried about that. What they're worried about is a much more important, difficult question that is core to the SEC's mission. And that's the one that Allison Lee raised way at the start of this panel. I hope we'll talk more about it. This being an accounting conference, I hope we'll talk about some real policy questions, and accounting ones in particular. You see, Commissioner Lee wants to know, given that there's going to be the production of GHD relevant information under the SEC's rules, should we have assurance of that information, and if so, what kind? And she said something that I think is crucial that I want to highlight for all the accountants listening in today. The point she made is that there is going to be some process for third-party assurance, and we know from years of data, Sarbanes-Oxley, pick your context, that the prospect of third-party assurance not only provides more accurate information to investors, but the ex-ante idea that it might occur actually provides investor protection because management tend to take more care with respect to the actual estimates they give. I don't think anybody on this panel or on anyone on the SEC actually wants the data produced by this rule to be noisy or sloppy or reflective of a lack of oversight in the way that the accounting information we got prior to Sarbanes-Oxley could sometimes be. So I'm hopeful, like Allison Lee, that those in the audience will be debating and discussing what the right mode of assurance is to make sure that the information produced by this rule is the useful information that investors need. Thanks, Colleen.
So thanks, Rob. So for the next, let's say, 20 or so minutes, I would love to give you guys an opportunity to, first respond to each other, to if there were any other issues that somebody else raised that you think would be good to respond to and helpful to, have a discussion. Joe, I assume you would like to go first, so you are.
Sure, I would, but I have several things to say. But before I say anything, I'd like to invite Rob. If Rob, you're willing to comment on some of Rob Stebbins to comment on some of Rob Jackson's views, and then I'll. Yeah, sure.
I don't know that I have any particular comments. I mean, as to whether it's a serious issue, that major questions doctrine. I mean, I think I have trouble reading the case and not thinking it's a really serious question for the SEC. And we can say we're climate experts at the SEC other than Satyam. I don't know who that person is. Maybe it's Commissioner Lee, but it's not an expertise in the commission. It just isn't. I don't see how this isn't a really serious concern and issue for the commission. I'm not, and the rules are going to pass. They're definitely going to pass. And we're going to get to find out. So maybe Rob and I are going to bet $5 as to what's going to happen.
Yeah. So, as I look, I think the two Robs are on opposite sides of the coin, and I'm going to agree with Rob against Rob. Basically, Rob Stebbins against Rob Jackson. And I'm just going to make a couple of points, and I'm going to make them as briefly as I can. Number one, Rob Jackson, you and your colleagues were just flat out wrong in predicting the results in West Virginia versus EPA. Just flat out wrong. To me, and I've been public about this, is the Supreme Court granted certiorari in a case where it was totally discretionary. There was no rule that the Supreme Court really had to look at. This was a gratuitous grant of cert. The grant of cert occurred, in my view, because the Supreme Court is on a mission. The Supreme Court's mission is to cabin the administrative state. Now, every one of us on this call might disagree with that objective, and I do too, but that's what they're doing. And to me, the result in West Virginia versus EPA was entirely predictable on the day that cert was granted, and what we see is a step towards a very muscular and expansive interpretation of the major questions doctrine. And I would agree with Rob Stebbins that this creates very significant litigation risk. And I think the consensus among all practitioners is that the probability that the SEC's rules withstand judicial review after West Virginia is significantly lower than it was prior to West Virginia. Second, Clean Air Act, 1970. What supporters of the SEC's authority argue misses one very important Supreme Court precedent. And that precedent is a case called Teamsters versus Daniel. In Teamsters versus Daniel, the United States Supreme Court ruled that a defined benefit pension plan that actually invested in the stock market was not a security subject to SEC regulation because of the existence of ERISA, the Employment Retirement Income Securities Act of 1974. That was 1974, not 1970. So the existence of ERISA was interpreted by the Supreme Court as saying that primary responsibility for that form of regulation should rest with the Department of Labor rather than with the SEC, even though the money was invested in the stock market. Now, it would be trivially easy, and many of us could say unfortunately, for the Supreme Court to write a short opinion saying, we don't even have to get to the major questions doctrine. We're simply going to look at our precedent in Teamsters versus Daniel, where if Congress subsequently acts to give authority to a different regulatory agency, that divests the SEC of authority over those issues. Now, it follows almost a fortiori that if Congress, by passing ERISA, where money is invested in the stock market, means that the SEC can't regulate those pension plans, if Congress passes the Clean Air Act of 1970 that gives the EPA the authority to regulate disclosure regarding emissions, that the SEC doesn't have that authority. And the Supreme Court can write that opinion without even getting to the major questions doctrine and argue it's a simple question of statutory construction and inference from congressional behavior. Now, I don't know that they're going to do that. That's a litigation risk. But what I am saying is that this alternative approach isn't susceptible of that risk. And for that reason, if we want to have good, vigorous disclosure that will survive Supreme Court review, this is the way to go. And then let me ask one question for Commissioner Jackson and Commissioner Lake. Name the 5 Supreme Court justices that would support climate disclosure as currently proposed, and give me odds that they will actually support that. The art of Supreme Court litigation is simply about counting to 5. Would love to hear the 5 that you think would support.
Colleen, maybe I'll quickly jump in since some of that is directly responsible, but of course,
just very quick, Rob, just bear in mind most of the attendees at this conference will not be lawyers. So if you can make this big picture, thank you.
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. So the short version is our group made no prediction about West Virginia versus EPA. Everybody saw what was coming in that case, and it's got nothing to do with what's happening in the Supreme Court. Just to give non-lawyers a background, what happened in West Virginia versus EPA is the EPA, after many years of wanting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from sources of certain emissions, decided to actually take steps to shut down those emission sources. And the SEC, the Supreme Court said, well, you don't have the statutory authority to do that. And they were building on cases that go all the way back 30 years ago. Here's another example. The Food and Drug Administration woke up in the Clinton administration and said, hey, it turns out we have the power to regulate tobacco. And for 40 years, they had said that they didn't. And in fact, a few years before, they said that they didn't. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not how this works. You said you didn't have the authority. You don't have the authority. That has nothing to do with a disclosure rule at the SEC that builds on 40 years of disclosure and a specific statute that says the SEC's mission includes these considerations, that the SEC interpreted to include those considerations 50 years ago that no one has said anything about since. Now, again, I want to emphasize, and by the way, let me just say that you haven't heard from Bob or Joe about Biden versus Missouri, which is a 5-justice opinion. And Joe, the answer to your question is Brett Kavanaugh. In Biden versus Missouri, those justices uphold the Medicare and Medicaid decision to address COVID considerations at Medicaid facilities. Of course, everyone argued that Medicaid didn't have the authority to go that far. And 5 justices rejected it and said, literally the quote from that opinion is, dealing with Medicaid facilities is what the Secretary of Health and Human Services does. Dealing with disclosure is what the SEC does. Bob and Joe would have an argument if what the SEC was doing is substantively regulating the climate. And everyone agrees with that, but that's not what they're doing. What they're doing is mandating disclosure, which is why these arguments haven't been really taken that seriously. And I have to say, just to be clear, the letter that I wrote, which had nothing to do, didn't make any prediction about West Virginia versus EPA, was joined by Republicans, Democrats. It was a careful history observing 50 years of SEC rulemaking by several general counsels, several former chairs of all parties. And this kind of lawyers dancing on the head of a pin stuff is not really driving the debate. I will say this, for those of you who are listening in wondering, isn't it interesting that lawyers go into the SEC and make this argument? I want to tell you a little bit about how SEC rulemaking happens. This is how it happens. The SEC makes a proposal, and people who don't like it come up with all kinds of crazy reasons why they don't want the SEC to do it. And in the background, there's a threat that the SEC is going to get dragged into court, and some randomly chosen set of judges is going to make policy. That's not an optimal way to make policy, and I agree that that's how it happens. But that's not the way the real decision makers at the SEC are going to affect these markets. The way they're going to affect the markets, the decision they're going to make is going to be driven by what investors care about. It's very clear in any boardroom in America right now that this is a subject investors are focused on, and that, not guesswork about what Brett Kavanaugh is going to have for breakfast in 3 years, is going to drive the outcome of the SEC. But I don't know, Allison, whether you share that perspective.
I do. I'll tell you, I'll touch on something that you mentioned and that Bob Stebbins raised, and that is this idea that it's not our expertise at the SEC, or that we don't possess the expertise to deal in this issue, which of course would be part of the analysis that would be made by the Supreme Court. And of course, that depends on how you view what it is we're doing. And as you point out, Rob, what we're doing, or what the SEC was doing with that proposal, is focusing on our expertise, which is disclosure. The disclosure of risks and opportunities, description of business for companies that sell registered securities. So if setting aside the notion of how long or how deep or how many years of expertise we may have on the staff, and I will submit to you, we have many. We have decades of expertise in the climate space, because we have been reviewing and thinking about these issues for, as Rob points out, several decades. But I think that the critical thing here is to remember what it is we're trying to accomplish, and that is disclosure. I think your point, too, about the recent Biden case is a good one in this regard. There are some limiting principles potentially at play, in my view, that might enable Justice Roberts, Justice Kavanaugh, whoever it might be. We're sort of Monday morning quarterbacking here before the game has even been played. But and one of them is this. One of the things that we're trying to do with this proposal is not create a disclosure regime, but rather fix one that is broken, one that is in existence right now and is not serving capital markets appropriately and is resulting in the misallocation of capital. That is a potential limiting principle for those justices to consider and think about as they look at what it is we're trying to do with this rule. I'm not going to engage in speculation about predicting who will do what where, but I do think there are some principles at play here that may well override some of these considerations and hopefully get markets where they need to be in terms of the transparency on these important issues.
Thank you, Allison. And if I just may return to Rob for a second, I think, Rob, you're misapprehending and perhaps even mischaracterizing my proposal. Because I'm not saying that the Commission can't and shouldn't go ahead with whatever rules it wants to adopt. Go right ahead. What I am saying is that in addition to anything that the Commission wants to do, it should also adopt a rule that says if you're disclosing climate information pursuant to EU regulations and California regulations and EPA regulations, aggregate that up. We'll give you a standardized form and report it on that form as well, and that will actually have more information than would be required under the current rules. So in other words, Rob, what I'm saying, and to be totally accurate about it, what my letter says is, look, to the SEC, go ahead and adopt whichever rules you want. Knock yourself out. All right? Adopt the rules as proposed, make whatever modifications you want, go right ahead. But in addition to that, if Exxon is disclosing information to the EU and to California and to the EPA, let's make it efficient for investors. Let's aggregate that information in one place, and we will then have all of that information We'll eliminate the double counting and we'll have better information. That's what I'm proposing. I've never said that I'm skeptical about the SEC's ability to withstand judicial review, as is Rob Stebbins. But I haven't said the SEC shouldn't adopt those rules. My letter says specifically, go ahead, knock yourself out, adopt whatever rules you want. But in addition,
I just want to jump in, and Bob
rules,
or Satyam, if either of you guys
do you have an opposition to that?
Like to jump in, please do.
I just wanted to emphasize the point that the disclosures for the EPA are not for investors. That's not why they exist. They exist for the purposes, the environmental remediation purposes of the Clean Air Act. There's to the extent to which investors care about the thresholds, the extent to which it's material, et cetera, all the core securities law questions don't apply because that's a different set of data for a different purpose. Investors, there's a lot to unpack in Joe's word, aggregating it up. That could be an enormously difficult task for anyone, even the most incredible data scientists, to do. And to simply say we can aggregate that up to the parent company level, add in your supply chains or whatnot, is an enormously difficult task. But remember, the SEC has a consolidated parent, has authority to require reporting at the consolidated parent, and the EPA does not. The EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act is at the facility level. Now, you might say you can add up the facilities and this and that. Again, this is a really difficult task. So that word aggregating there's a lot going on in there, and we should be clear about how impractical that task is.
Colleen, if I could just jump in and add one quick thought, because I want to be responsive to Joe. Joe's latest letter, I think, raises a very important and interesting point. Joe, my answer to you on using the EPA or other data would be Satyam's answer. It's not obvious to me it's designed for investor consumption, and since you and I have spent so long thinking about this disclosure designed for investors, we can both agree that the kind of disclosure you might design for one purpose might not be the one you design for another purpose. But Joe, you have raised, I think, a very interesting possibility that I want to ask Bob Stebbins about. The possibility Joe's latest letter raises is, you might consider doing this in steps. And I think, Joe, here you're onto something. And let me say a little bit about why. First of all, the SEC's rulemaking process in general often benefits where there is some kind of seriatim engagement process with the public. It gives them more time to build an evidentiary record, more data to draw from. And I can tell you one of the things I worked on when I was working with Bob Stebbins when he was GC, Bob, our market structure reform efforts led by you and Chair Jay Clayton proceeded that way, in a way. Wouldn't you agree, Bob? They proceeded in a straightforward series of steps that built on each other. And just to be clear, Jay eventually took all the steps. But the D.C. Circuit just on Friday afternoon upheld yet another judgment in this area of the SEC. And it seems like, Bob, the courts are more open to rulemaking that proceeds in segments, drawing on data and reactions that we get over time. And I take, Joe, that to be part of the thrust of your latest letter. And Bob, I'm wondering, as a former general counsel of the commission, what you make of the idea of rulemaking over time, drawing on some data that's produced by each step in that process.
Well, I certainly think it's very beneficial to see how the rules are playing out and to have data done by and work done by people like yourselves, academics, to analyze the data that we do have and then write on it, and the commission uses in the letters. I do think it's a great way to do law. I'm not as big a fan of just, and both parties are guilty of it, of just changing the rules when one party gets in, even though there's no data yet that's changed. I'm not a big fan of that. I do like seeing a real reason to do it. And I think it makes it a lot easier for the SEC when they go into court to say, here's why we're doing it. And to be clear, these are my people defending these rules, and I'm always going to root for my people to win. So I'm very happy that they won again in the D.C. Circuit. That's a couple in a row, and hopefully that will continue.
Yeah, but if I'm listening carefully, I think we have progress with the other Rob, with Rob Jackson, because I think accurately described, my proposal says to the commission, knock yourself out, adopt whatever you want. It's great. And let's hope that it works. And let's hope that Rob Jackson's interpretation of the Supreme Court is more accurate than mine. That's the result I want. It's not the result I think I'm going to get, but it's the result that I want. Now, in addition to that, why don't we also simply require aggregation of information already in the public domain?
Well, Joe, to be responsive, as I was saying, I think those aren't designed for investors. So what the risk you get is confusion. And Allison, I want to ask. I'm just curious for your view, Allison, about this possibility of doing this over time, because you've been at the commission very, very recently. And it might be helpful to give some context for the pros and cons of doing things in pieces as opposed to doing things all at once.
Well, you're right to point out that we had some success with that recently in the market structure space. Those particular rules, of course, build on each other in a way that you don't necessarily have the luxury of doing in this space right now when it comes to climate. Understand, too, that what we did with the climate proposal was focused solely on climate. This is not an ESG proposal. It doesn't rope in any number of other potentially significant issues when it comes to sustainable investing, but focuses instead on climate. So I am not averse to the notion of building on data as we get it in the markets. Here, we're just looking at 5 pieces, essentially, of information that we think is relevant to climate for investors. So I don't necessarily see the need to break that down. But Joe, I take your point about building in some kind of mechanism whereby we might have a better assurance that over time we will in fact get better transparency into the markets. So I don't have a view that you're necessarily wrong or incorrect in your approach. And it does turn at some level on kind of trying to second guess what the Supreme Court will or won't do. But I do think here we have done exactly that. We have one step in the right direction on climate disclosure with 5 very, very basic premises, encompassed in this proposal. I want to add one other quick thing while I have a couple of minutes here to Bob Stebbins' point about changing regulations. That is another issue, of course, and another reason why I think it's important for us to get a rule out right now that would advance transparency on these important issues, because we do see that. We saw that in the last administration when they came in 2017. We see some of that now. That is not necessarily optimal for markets, and I think we need to make sure that we minimize that where we can, so that if we have a regime that requires that spans out over the course of 5 or 6 years, is there any guarantee that regime will actually be completed?
So given the time constraints, I think it would be best if we move on into sort of concluding thoughts. So let's go in reverse order from where we started. And I would ask each of you to spend 1 to 2 minutes. If there's anything else that you want to touch on from the discussion that you didn't have an opportunity to say, please jump in. I think the audience would be really interested in anything more about how you chose the assurance provisions in the proposal. We would also, because we're academics, many of us, we would love to hear about the topics that you think are, really important for us to study. We would also be interested in hearing other areas of ESG that remain and that, there's still rules to move forward on. So I'll start with Rob, then we'll go with Joe, then we will have Bob, then Satyam, then Allison.
Well, thanks again, Colleen. I've so enjoyed the conversation. As always, I've learned a lot from Joe, Bob, and Allison, and Satyam. I'll be very brief. To me, the thing that I haven't had a chance to say, you've heard a lot of SEC inside baseball here. You've heard a lot about what we do to try and predict what the courts might do, what policymakers might do, what folks on Capitol Hill might do. But as you know from Colleen's introduction, my original sin in my career is that I went to business school before I went to law school. And what we haven't talked about is that markets, not folks in Washington, are driving this. You see, trillions of dollars have been invested on a thesis that these issues are important. And all of you who are listening know that at the end of the day, markets win out over even the most ardent political philosophy or opposition. And so, as Colleen has pointed out, what's really going to be crucial in the way all of you can help us, I said this the last time I was at CARE, and I want to say it again, is using these data to study what we can learn. about companies and their activities in this space, and in particular, how companies are responding to the SEC's mandate and what kinds of changes companies are making or not making in response to those things. You see, to me, when the market makes those kinds of responses and moves in response to the SEC, and you all help us study them systematically, that's where we get the best policy. That's where folks can have an actual informed conversation about what investors want, who really care, what they really care about, and allows them to have a conversation with the boards of the companies that they own about the kinds of steps they do or don't want them to take in this space. That's really, to me, what this policymaking moment is about. So for each one of you out there, whether you're preparing your dissertation or got tenure a long time ago, please think about using these new data to tell us something, teach us something about the way companies think about climate, because we're at the beginning, not the end of the journey of giving investors more information in this space.
Thank you. And Joe?
I do think this has been a terrific conversation, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate, Colleen, because I think we've made significant progress, at least towards the end, where if there's consensus that the SEC can go ahead and do what it wants to do, that's great. And then we've got this additional information, and let me just observe that if you read the California and EU requirements, not only do they require attestation, so you get attestation of data without an SEC requirement of attestation, which raises its other whole separate set of issues, but you get the attestation of data and you have Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 information, which would be reported relatively cleanly. The Scope 3 information isn't even subject to a materiality requirement. The information that winds up coming out pursuant to the European regulations also is a double materiality standard that the SEC cannot require on its own, at least I don't think it will, which is why that's going to be even more expansive information. You report that up cleanly, Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, that's the information that the SEC wants to get. It isn't useful as provided. And if Rob is right that that information is provided under these other forms, it also isn't useful as provided under the SEC form. So this is information that is useful to investors, right? It's clearly useful to investors, and it's a situation where it comes out. It's going to wind up being subject to various forms of attestation and confirmation, and these proposals should be embraced, and the Commission should move forward for this additional form of disclosure as promptly as possible.
Thanks again for allowing me to participate. It's a very fun panel for me to be on. A lot of people who care deeply about the issues and care about the SEC, and it's nice that you can have a civilized disagreement about some issues. It's very fun and refreshing, I think. But anyway, as to one of your questions as to is there anything academics that we would recommend that academics think about that would be useful for the Commission? I think the one thing would be a retrospective on what's worked well sometimes. We always look at when issues arise, when problems, we go right there. I think sometimes there's been laws passed, things like Sarbanes-Oxley, a lot of good seems to have come out of laws like that. Research into what was done right there so we could do it again. I think it'd be something to keep in mind sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you. We had a little bit of feedback on that, but I think most of it came through, so thank you. And Satyam?
My overall point is echoing what Rob Jackson had said about this being the beginning. I think that no matter what happens with the SEC's rule in federal court, we can all speculate as to what that might be. Investors really care about that information, and I think they will continue to care about that information in the years to come. These risks, these risks are of great concern to them, and I don't think investors are asking, what's going to happen this and that with the Supreme Court. But they're more concerned with getting information from boards about these risks. And I think well-counseled boards are starting to do that as well. So I'm very long that investors will care about these issues no matter what happens in federal courts. And I think folks should be thinking along those lines too.
Thank you. And Allison?
Thanks. So I too would like to echo something that Rob said, which is this is driven by markets, and it is. And that means that investors are going to use this information. They're using what information they can get their hands on right now, and that's how they're allocating capital and pricing risk. So as part of what we're doing here, we have to recognize that what we do is going to drive capital allocation decisions. And that's why I have focused on the assurance piece to try to understand, how much assurance do we need? So to the extent we have academics out there who are thinking about these issues and willing to help us unpack them a little more, what I would say is help us understand how significant is the distinction between review and reasonable assurance. And because again, what's riding on it is trillions of dollars that are going to change hands and trillions worth of investment decisions that are going to be made. How much reliability do we need around which metrics? Again, my preliminary view had been it's greenhouse gas emissions. There's some data out there that shows that in fact investors are using greenhouse gas emissions more centrally than any other data point. How much reliability do we need? And is there a real distinction between limited assurance and reasonable assurance? Would love to get some academic information and feedback on that.
I think we're at 1 hour. So thank you guys all so much. That was fantastic. I am sure the audience will love it. So thank you again. It was really helpful.